Okay, so now that we've talked about the third-person character, we can talk about the first-person character. And the first-person character, as you can see here, is changed quite a bit from the default first-person character you get in the template. Now, functionally, it is very similar. The main things you'll see here are that the arms skeletal mesh appear to be gone, and the gun model is different. The gun model is now not a skeletal mesh, it is a static mesh, which there are some nuances to that. Static meshes don't have bones, and they can't be animated the same way that skeletal meshes are. They also don't have physics assets the way that the skeletal meshes do, the static meshes don't. But if we look at the construction script, not the construction script, I'm sorry, the event graph, you can see a lot of the same stuff. Now, a couple things are different here as well, and you'll see that reflected also in the component hierarchy. Right now in 14.8, 4.18 version 4.18, a lot of this is filled with a bunch of VR related stuff, and I have no intentions of making this a VR project at all. But this blueprint has like VR pointer arms and VR input checks and VR all the stuff. I have and like also head mounted display looking and all that stuff. I have removed all of that entirely. It is all completely gone. Um, and even though this says if using HMD movement is basically that comment is no like well this thing is still here, but it doesn't actually affect anything. We don't have none of that's being used. And if you kind of go down, you look at this lookup. Oh, this is a little different. Like yes, well I'll get into those changes when we get into this specifically for the aim down sights. But for the most part, it is pretty similar. So if we go back to the viewport, you'll see, okay, there's this gun and it's kind of bobbing up and down, but the arms aren't there. What is the deal with that? Well, what the deal with that is because this gun model is not a skeletal mesh, like I said, static, I can't animate it. If I want animations, I need to be parented to something that can animate it. So I've actually kept the arms around, and now that you kind of see them highlighted, you can see if we can go to, what is it, UE4, UE4 man body, they're actually still there. They're just there so I can have my, bobbing up and down, my fire animations, reload animation, but I don't actually want them visible because I don't like the way they look. So I simply made a invisible. No, that's the skeleton mesh. I'm sorry. Invisible material. I just made a material that's translucent and has has zero opacity, so they just don't show up. Probably not the best thing for the rendering, but it's mostly fine. Um, and then you can see here the parenting works very similarly. Now you'll see this thing called ADS camera. We're gonna get into that. That's the aim down sights feature. That's the kind of one of the bigger changes I had to make. But other than that, it's really just setting up this mesh. Which if we can go to, you can see it is a static mesh. It has a single socket, which I made, and then a thing came with a material. When I imported it, a lot of times when you import static meshes, they don't come with a material actually assigned on. So what you end up with is you get this blank material and like you have your like TGA file or whatever. All you have to do with that, go to this material. You've got this texture. You go into this thing, and then you just create your texture sample and set it equal to that TGA. Set it to the base color of the material instead of the default white, and then suddenly your weapon will look like its weapon because all the UVs will come over and it'll be fine. And that's that's a decent introduction to what the first-person character is. Like I said, I'll go into how the shooting has changed, how the aim down sights works. Also, the character now has health and some of and also the gun fires automatically. So I'll go over that in pieces next. Okay, let's talk about aiming down the sights. Now, aiming down the sights is not something that the engine like this template has in it by default. There are a lot of tutorials on how to do it online because obviously it's a very standard feature in most modern first-person shooters, but it's just not something, well, it's certainly not an Unreal Tournament. So This implementation relies on using a second camera. As you can see, this little tiny camera right here. This is my ADS camera. And then it is parented to the gun mesh, which is this full thing, which is then parented to the arms, which is parented to the camera. And by having the camera here, you can guarantee it'll always be right behind the gun when you switch to it. Now, switching to it once it's set up here is not too complicated. We have a new input action called ADS, which I can show you in the project settings how we do that. We go to input, and then there are these action mappings. Added one more. The reset VR is still here, but well, that's not being used. We see that's the right mouse button, and if you look at pressed, we are deactivating the first-person camera, and then activating the ADS camera. And then we set is ADS, which is a Boolean that's just going to keep track of whether we're aiming down sights. We're going to set that to true, and we're going to set the max walk speed, which is the always walk speed. It's max is kind of, I don't know. The max walk speed is 200, so you walk a little slower if you do it. So if I'm walking here, I'm kind of moving fast, then I'm aiming down sights and I'm moving slow. You can kind of see some effects of the parenting of the arms. Like I still haven't quite got it right. See it's a little tilted, but I need to play with that a little more. But the basic idea is there. So, and then when you release, you will basically do the opposite. You'll deactivate the ADS camera, activate the first-person camera, set is ADS to false. You'll set the max walk speed to 600, which is the default. And then the other thing you have to do is set the relative rotation of the gun back to the gun start rotation. And then the other part to that is this setting the start gun rotation. Because you're doing this rotation with the when you're in aim down sights, you're actually changing the local rotation of the gun as opposed to changing the rotation of the camera, which by its parenting will move the gun even though its local rotation never changes. When you release the aim down sights, you need to set it back to what it was standard, and instead of just kind of hard coding what its local rotation is, because I'm still having to make these adjustments because this is still kind of totally in the wrong position. Instead of just hard coding that, because if you look at its rotation now, it's kind of these very weird specific values. So instead of making that just it's some static variable or some final variable, I'm just having it set no matter what it is, no matter how I change it, so that when you at the beginning of the play, you'll set it. When you deactivate ADS, you will go back to that rotation and it'll always work. You look at the camera and you look at the rotation. You use pawn control rotation. That means that the camera will rotate with the rotation of the pawn, which is already set up to rotate with the mouse, because standard, that just comes standard. If you look at the mouse input, it adds controller yaw input. And then if you look at this look up, it's actually, I've done a bunch of other weird stuff. I'm checking if ADS is equal to true, meaning if you're aiming down the sights. Then I am manually adding rotation to both the gun mesh and the sphere, which is kind of the point off the end of the gun. It's this little, this thing, to those two things. And then I am setting those rotations, which is it's adding to the X rotation, which is the roll, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but it just happens to be, it is the roll. It works out that way. I had to try a couple different things. And then I'm also adding to the controller pitch input, so when I switch back, if you switch out of ADS, the camera will still be in the right place, because we want to continue to rotate both. It's just that if I don't do this manual rotation, when I look up and down, the actual gun doesn't move, because if you look at the ADS camera, I do not have use pawn control rotation set, because if I do, that creates a lot of other problems. So having these two cameras creates some issues I've kind of had to smooth over with some kind of work like this. So that's why I'm setting that. So the last part of aim down sights is the fact that the way it's supposed to be used, or the way it's typically used, is that when you're aiming down sights, you fire much more accurately, whereas when you're not, you fire less accurately. So if you look here, you kind of see these projectiles sort of just kind of go all over the place, whereas they're harder to see, but because the camera's shaking, but they're much more accurate this way. The way I'm doing that is if you go to spawn projectile would typically just kind of take the position of the sphere, or yeah, the position of the character really, to determine how to rotate like determine the direction in which the projectile was going. I made this whole other function called get fire direction, and that just adds a little bit of variability to the rotation of the shot. So it's one branch is aimed down sights. If it is true, if you're aiming down sights, you add like a 0.5% float in, like 0.5% variability to each axis to the gun rotation, which is the aiming direction basically. And then if you do not have aim down sights, instead of 0.5, it's 5. So that negative 5 to 5 like degree difference is actually adding quite a bit of variability and making the bullets go in different directions. And that kind of gives you the basic functionality of making this bigger cone of fire and kind of penalizing the player for not using aiming down sights when they are trying to fire at an enemy. And I can show you. It's pretty hard to hit this guy like this. Well, I can still do it. But if I do this, that's 2 shots and he's gone. So it works as well as I'd want it to. The next thing I want to change with that is to make the camera shake a little bit less, like change the animation montage I play if you're aiming down sights, because this is really crazy. But other than that, I'm pretty happy with the way it works, and that's pretty much all there is to aiming down sights.